WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Boston Globe transportation reporter Taylor Dolven, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Daryl.
Yes, it's been a while, right?
Yeah, too long.
I know. Well, you're back because you recently did some reporting about how a lot of people prefer to drive rather than take the T because it's just more reliable and, I guess, less miserable in some cases, right?
Exactly.
And that's a big problem for our climate, right? I want to get into this question first with some numbers. What's the data behind this?
So we know that MBTA ridership is at about 60% of what it was before the pandemic, whereas car travel is back to what it was. Traffic is just as bad as it was before the pandemic. So there are a lot of people who were making trips on the MBTA before the pandemic who haven't returned to doing that.
Why exactly is the T so unappealing for many commuters at this moment? What answers did they give you?
I think mostly it's the reliability factor. So transit, as you know, Daryl, as a former transit reporter, works best when you show up to your bus stop or your train stop or whatever kind of stop, and you don't have to think about when your ride is going to show up to take you where you're going. It just comes, and you don't have to plan your life around when you should leave your house. And that it has not been the case at the MBTA for a very, very long time. As you know, subway times and bus times, wait times have increased dramatically over the last year and a half. And so I think that is the biggest factor really discouraging people from using the T as their main way to get around.
Right. And, Taylor, we're having this conversation, after federal climate scientists reported that last month was the hottest July on record. And then for Boston specifically, it was the second rainiest month on record. Can you make the connection between climate change and the T's inability to be attractive to drivers, to pull people out of their cars?
In order for the state to reduce transportation emissions, so the greenhouse gases coming out of cars and other vehicles, we need to have fewer cars on the road and cars driving a lot less miles. And so the best way to get people where they need to go is to group them together in buses and trains or to have them walking and biking. And because the MBTA is malfunctioning in so many ways and service has deteriorated so dramatically, it's just not an attractive option to someone who could drive. There are going to be people who use the T because it's the only way they can get around. They don't have a car. But for the people who do have access to a car, that's a lot more convenient when you think about slow zones, when you think about wait times, when you think about disruptions, derailments. And if we want to reduce transportation emissions, we really need more people to be choosing the T over their cars.
Now, you talk to some drivers who live near MBTA services, and they rarely use them. What were their stories?
Yeah, I talked to a guy who, this is the first one that comes to mind. He lives in Newton, and he could walk to the Green Line, and he could also walk to the commuter rail. And he works from home, but he still goes into Boston about once a month for meetings with clients in the Seaport, to see the Red Sox, to go to see the symphony. And he always drives. And he says, I just don't have faith that if I leave my house at a certain time, I'm going to get to where I'm going by the time I need to get there. And so this is someone who, bought a house to be walking distance from the MBTA and is instead choosing to drive his car. I asked him, what would it take for you to give up your car and take the T instead? And he said wait times would have to be down to at the most 10 minutes between trains. And I would have to have some assurance that my train's not going to break down on a regular basis.
That's interesting that he lives so close to these services and doesn't use them, right? People pay good money to be close to transit.
Yeah. And when you think about the MBTA communities law, which is basically mandates that municipalities with T stations allow for multifamily housing to be created near those T stations, this is such a complicating factor, right? Because if you build a bunch of apartments near a train station and the train is only coming once an hour and it's costing, $40 round trip, who renting those apartments is going to be able to rely on that train?
Right.
So at the same time, the state is encouraging housing construction near transit stations. It's not doing the other piece, which is improving transit to make it so that the people living in that housing don't have to drive anywhere.
Right. So what are the T's goals as it relates to addressing the climate?
The T's goals are really the state's goals. So
Okay.
the T is a big component of, obviously it's the biggest transit system in the state. And the state has goals to reduce transit emissions by 2025, by 2030, by 2050. And so part of those plans are very vague descriptions of the MBTA service improving. And what we've seen over the last, 2 years is the MBTA service going the opposite direction, really worsening. And so, I think there's one major way that the T can play a big role in reducing climate emissions, and that's by becoming the most attractive option, like we talked about. There's also the T has goals to electrify its bus system, which will also help. Right now its buses use diesel or are diesel hybrids. And so it has a legal obligation to electrify its bus system in the coming years. So that's another component that it's also struggling with. But just when we look at being the most attractive way to get around, I think that's the key to how the T can really play a big role in reducing transportation emissions.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. You mentioned electrifying the buses. From what I understand, electric vehicles in general are a big piece of the state's transit climate emissions goals, right?
Yeah, so the state has goals. It wants to reduce transportation emissions by a certain amount below 1990 levels. For the transportation sector, the state is relying almost exclusively on everyone who owns a gas car giving it up and buying an electric car, and that being the main way to get rid of greenhouse gases from cars.
But not necessarily getting people onto transit.
Right, exactly. So the state has a very not very ambitious goal to reduce driving, which is that between 2015 and 2030, so over a span of 15 years, Massachusetts is aiming to reduce the vehicle miles traveled by each household by 3%. And so I looked at what these goals are for other states to give you an idea. In California, over the same time frame, they're aiming for a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled. In Washington state, it's around 16%. In places that don't have any subway service, like Colorado or Minnesota, it's around 7 or 8%.
So there seems to be some misalignment here.
Experts will say we need to do both. We absolutely need electric vehicles. There's no way around that. Problem is, we can't do that very fast. Whereas if someone is driving a gas car today and they're riding the bus tomorrow, that is by far the quickest way to reduce emissions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Philip Ng, the new general manager for the T. What does he have to say about all of this? Is he optimistic? Is he getting weary already? Like, where's he at with this?
I think there is no one as optimistic as him, which is just so interesting, even now, several months into his tenure. He has this vision for the MBTA that it is just going to be the absolute best way to get somewhere. He envisions, people taking the T to breweries and pub hopping and like getting around to all social events across the region, always on the T. His vision seems to really align with that of these advocates who say we need to make taking transit more attractive. He talks a lot about, the service people deserve and restoring pre-pandemic service as a start and hopefully, improving service in the future on the subway, bus system, and commuter rail. So I think he's optimistic that the MBTA can play a big role in this effort too.
Okay, so Ng is optimistic, and I'm curious to know about what state officials are thinking, right? And Maura Healey just signed a new budget for the fiscal year. How much money is going toward the T and investing in these climate goals?
The T is getting some much needed new money, but it's one-time money. So it's not funding that will carry over year, which climate and transit advocates have long been pushing for. Something that the T desperately needs is more staff. And so part of the funding that is in this new budget is going to go toward hiring and hopefully, getting more people on board so that more trains can run, more buses can run, which will only make service better and hopefully attract more riders. But the MBTA has a fundamental problem in that it's going to be over $100 million short come next summer just for basics like salaries, fuel, paying its debts. And so advocates would really like to see long-term sustainable funding for the T, a new revenue source to really plug the gaps permanently.
And with that said, Taylor, what are you watching out for as it relates to the T and the climate?
I tried to talk to the Healey administration for my story about the state's targets to reduce driving, and they didn't make anyone available for an interview, but they did say that they were looking at what goals the state has set for that, and we're considering, tweaks to those. So I think that's really important. Is the Healey administration going to take another look at how we're approaching reaching our emissions reductions goals while it's the hottest summer of all time, or not? And I think that will play out over the next, few months and into the next year.
Well, Taylor, thank you so much for your work and so much for your time. Thank you for coming through to The Common.
Thanks for having me, Daryl.
That's Boston Globe transportation reporter Taylor Dolven. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you like what you're hearing, please go to wherever you listen to podcasts, especially Apple or Spotify. Rate and review us. We'd really, really, really appreciate it. And thank you ahead of time. And if you want to get in touch with us, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR-The-Common or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy. I'll talk to you soon.